by all rights, I should not like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I would love to be super negative on here, but I'm making an exception right now because this simply should not work. Focusing more on fights than story is my biggest pet peeve in manga. It's why Jujutsu Kaisen and Bleach bug me so much, but JoJo does that 100% of the time. Maybe things will change later on, I'm only on part 6, but exactly none of the storylines so far have been good enough to justify the raw number of mostly pointless fight scenes. No matter how much style there is, there's gotta be some substance, and especially the earlier parts don't have nearly enough. I should not like this! But despite everything, I fucking love JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I think that Hirohiko Araki is not just a great writer, but that he's kind of a genius in his one specific niche. In fact, the fights in JoJo are not just fun and unique, but they justify themselves in a way that almost no other series can pull off. Stands are such a perfect balance of freedom and restriction that they put entire genres worth of competing power systems to shame, and all because they're so damn good at serving something completely else. I like to be pretentious and look at things from an entirely storytelling perspective, but sometimes a writer's so damn good at the mechanics of one thing that I can't not talk about it. Araki mastered his own kind of fight scene through the power of framing, stands, and raw fucking creativity. So let's honor that and go through what makes Shonen JoJo so special. A few months ago, I talked about power systems in a video on Shoujo X, but if we're talking stands, I want to go through things a little differently. Let's go back to the basics. At its core, power system is just a term we use to describe the internal logic of a given character's superpowers. They can apply to only one specific character, to everyone in a series, or anything in between. A person could even use multiple different power systems at the same time if it came down to it. This is a broad term. You can use it to describe something in basically every franchise with any kind of superhumans. If we want to talk comics, Green Lantern's power ring would be a pretty classic example of a power system, but you could also use it to describe something like Doctor Strange's magic, Wolverine's mutation, or even Batman's gadgets. At the most basic level, this can be almost anything. In battle anime like JoJo, though, if someone's talking about a power system, they usually mean something pretty specific. In this, and most cases really, a lot of things only technically count. What people are more likely referring to, and what we'll be talking about today, are power systems that act as a fairly universal way for any given character within a given story to access superhuman powers. Unlike huge interconnected universes like Marvel and DC, where you can kind of get away with giving everyone their own unique thing, in these series, most if not everyone gets their abilities in the same general way. While you can use it to describe more stuff, this is the kind of thing that the term power system was invented to describe, because here, most everyone's power works through the same system, and thus everyone can share some of the same rules and origins. Doing it this way also makes displays of power like fight scenes easier. Going in, you already have some idea of how a character got their powers, and depending on the example, you might also know some of their weaknesses, processes, and so on. It's a way to standardize things, which tends to make everything easier for everyone. Stands, as I've mentioned, are of this brand of power system. They're a way to standardize the origins and the explanations of all the very different supernatural abilities in JoJo post Part 3. In this case, the standardization is a physical manifestation of the soul which appears beside the user and gives them some mostly unique supernatural abilities. Regardless, for any power system, but especially one like this, whether or not it works for the story usually comes down to one thing: how well it balances freedom with limitations. You want as much freedom as you can get, because the more you can do with your power system, the more you can do with your story. However, you also want a bunch of restrictions, if only as insurance. Especially in a battle manga like JoJo, where fight scenes take up so much of the runtime, a lack of limitations makes it really easy to write yourself into a corner and create a character who's practically impossible to beat. This pretty famously happens at the end of Bleach. It will get animated next year. Yhwach, the final antagonist, turns out to be a literal god who, on top of being physically stronger than everyone, can also change the future at will. You tell me how to stop the guy who can decide how the fight ends. These issues often happen to good guys as well, especially with the overpowered mentor characters that have gotten so popular in the last few years. There's a reason that Gojo is taken out of the picture for 90% of Jujutsu Kaisen, and it's probably why Gege hates him so much. How in God's name is anyone supposed to get around an everlasting, impenetrable force field that's on top of things like Hollow Purple and Infinite Void, which make him almost unbeatable in offense? Gojo is straight up just too powerful to write a lot of the time. There's a reason Gojo vs. Sukuna is such a weird fight. Let me be clear though, too many restrictions might be a safer bet, but it's not a great idea either. One Piece, for example, allows for some unique sources of strength, often just letting people be superhuman without much explanation, but even it has to introduce a new power system halfway through because what there was stuck too many people in place. There are better examples though. Jojo itself struggles with this a lot in parts 1 and 2. Just look at the 2 separate power systems it used to have. The heroes have Hamon, which is a sort of sunlight energy powered by special breathing, while the villains are vampires, which on top of normal vampire things also allows them total control over their body. These systems do work for the stories being told with them, but they're also so limited that you don't even need to come up with many restrictions. They're built into the premises. Araki does some really clever stuff in those constraints, but especially by the end of part 2, he's clearly straying against the constraints. There's only so much you can do with body horror and ripple energy. Other series can and have made stuff like that work. Demon Slayer basically just rips off both of them and it does great. But JoJo's Bizarre Adventure needs something much less constrained. Tons of freedom is not just recommended, it's actually kind of necessary to manage more than a few of. In most stories, fight scenes are there for 2 main reasons. To do storytelling foremost, and then after that to build hype. As much as I talk about them, power systems are only really there to help the fight facilitate these 2 things. If the core of musicals is when the emotions are too big for talking, sing, then the core of battle manga is when the emotions are too big for talking, punch. Let's look at a really classic example from Dragon Ball Z, Goku and Piccolo's match with Raditz. Specific mechanics never really come into play here. It's much more fundamentally just this bombastic fight for the sake of the world and Goku's identity. He has to not just accept his alien heritage, but choose to reject it, teaming up with his former enemy to defend Earth and his family even at the cost of his life. Piccolo might go into detail on a special beam cannon, but the specifics of the move aren't really why you're here, you know? That's a good thing too, don't get me wrong. Stories should focus on, the story. A lot of my frustration with different battle manga comes with their tendency to lean too much into hype and completely forget that there's supposed to be a narrative here. JoJo's fights do tend to lean into hype, mechanics, and abilities way more than story, so you'd think I'd also get frustrated with them. Weirdly enough though, I think Araki justifies the sheer amount of fights in his manga by leaning as hard as he does into the specifics. Far more so than vehicles for storytelling or hype, the fight scenes in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are puzzles. These things present our heroes with a problem, usually in the form of a stand ability, and force them to use both their own powers and the tools around them to solve it. Let me give you an example without any stand so we can get a good look at the fundamental ideas. How about Johnathan vs. Dark Knight Blueford from all the way back in Phantom Blood? Here, the fight starts off underwater, which is a pretty central issue for 2 main reasons. First off, Johnathan will drown before too long, especially with his allies under guard and unable to help. More importantly though, if he can't breathe, he can't make Hamon, and right now that's the only way to defeat his undead opponent. To make things worse, Blueford is above him, meaning that even with the knight's heavy armor, there's no guarantee that Johnathan will make it to the surface without getting caught. Do you see what I'm getting at here? See the puzzle coming together? Rather than forcing Johnathan to beat him in a straight up duel, Blueford is forcing him to figure out a way to breathe underwater, either by risking a climb to the surface or pulling something unique from left field. Rather than fighting in this supposed fight scene, he solves the puzzle by swimming to the bottom of the lake and lifting a stone to breathe the air trapped underneath. Of course, he then uses that air to form some Hamon and punch Blueford in the face. But the core of the fight is not this punch, it's how we got to it. Compare that matchup with Jujutsu Kaisen's first Mahito fight. There is a problem being presented here. Mahito's powers make it so that only people who can touch souls are able to hurt him, but Gege Akutami doesn't ask our heroes to come up with a way to touch souls because that's not the point of this problem. Instead of building the fight, this problem is setting up Yuji, who can touch souls just by default, as the only person capable of beating Mahito. Each time they actually match up, which happens a couple more times after this, it's mostly just a straight fist fight, but with some magical abilities thrown in for spice. Even when a problem to be solved is introduced, it never goes as far as Araki does even this early on. Don't get me wrong, Jojo's fights aren't all one or the other, they aren't just puzzles, but they do tend to function more like thought experiments than, well, fight scenes. You could do that okay with Hamon and vampires, as we just saw, but things really get moving with the introduction of... Like I mentioned just a bit ago, Hamon and vampirism are both relatively limited power systems. There's a reason both Phantom Blood and Battle Tendency combined are notably shorter than any other single part. Where these power systems have heaps of limits built into the premise, stands can do whatever the hell you want. Because they're so open-ended, just being manifestations of the soul, anyone can have any power. The only built-in limit is Araki's imagination, and clearly he has quite a bit of that. You could have a stand that hurts by punching, or one that heals by punching. They could also heal through food, or swapping parts, or literally remaking your body through the environment. Sure, stopping time for 10 seconds is cool, but how about deleting 10 seconds of time? Or putting someone into a time loop? That sound too complicated? Let's keep it simple. How about control over sand, or water, or ice? Maybe you just want a guy with a sword. Or maybe you just want the sword itself. If you want a weapon though, you might as well get a gun. A gun with some little guys. An entire miniature army. That might be a little too complicated though. How about just a boat? Or a shark? A radio tower? Your own body? The fucking sun! A stand can be whatever you could possibly ever want it to be, and that means there are as many possible puzzles as there are ideas. The fights in JoJo get so much more numerous and interesting from part 3 onward just because the stands allow for so much more freedom. To illustrate just how much, think back to that fight from part 1 while we look at this one from part 4. Kobayashi here has a stand called the Lock. It allows him to create these, well, locks in people's chests when he makes them feel guilty. The more guilt, the bigger the lock. In quick succession, he creates one for Kokichi by tricking him into running over Kin, and then another one for Okuyasu after he knocks out one of Kobayashi's teeth. Josuke, our only free hero, now has to figure out how to get rid of his friend's guilt, and thus the locks, before Kobayashi uses it to take all of their money. He manages it by using his stand to heal the grifter's tooth, and then figuring out that the kitten Kokichi ran over was a fake. This isn't even a proper fight scene, let's be honest. It would be absolutely impossible to pull off with Hamon or vampirism, but at the core, this is the same kind of setup we had with Johnathan and Bluford. Antagonist creates puzzle that protagonist has to solve in order for them and or their friends to go free. Just to hammer things in, let's look at a more complicated one, this time from part 5. Here, Narantia is fighting 2 hidden stand users, and really fighting. They're trying to kill him and his friends. The first, Talking Mouth, can't hurt him, but it does infect his body and make him say the opposite of what he's thinking. That's a big problem because he needs to tell the rest of Team Bucciarati about the other stand. This one is called Crush. It attacks with razor-sharp fins from nearby liquids and it can teleport between them. That setup gives us 7 full chapters of problem solving, where Narantia has to find a way to get around Talking Mouth and tell his crew, while stopping Crush from killing everyone. Then after that, he has to find and kill the stand users responsible for this mess, Tizano and Squallow. The thing is much more complicated and much more violent than Kobayashi's grift or even Johnathan and Bluford's situation, but like everything we've gone over, it's the same puzzle core. Think back to that fight from part 1 and compare it with these two. Sure, Phantom Blood's matchup was compelling, but look at the sheer ingenuity on display when we're working with stance, the raw amount of things you can do with a power system that allows for any sort of ability. It's not just that these scenes would be impossible in parts 1 and 2, it's that you couldn't even get close. Stands allow for almost unlimited variation, and that's perfect for the kind of story that JoJo has made itself into. Where series like Evangelion or even Hell's Paradise thrive under more restrictive power systems, JoJo kinda needs something as broad and versatile as stands are. Even saying all that though, straight-up abilities are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to creativities with this power system. The fights really get interesting once Araki starts. Remember when I went over the way that power systems have to balance freedom with restrictions? Well, let's dive a little deeper into that second half. In this context, restriction is code for hard, universal laws. Lots of other genre can get away with keeping things less defined, that's usually for the best, really, but if the fights are going to be as important as they are in battle manga, the power system needs a set of defined rules that apply to every single user, every single time. First, so that the audience has some baseline understanding of everything they come across. That makes new characters and concepts easier, but more importantly, it also helps make sure that everyone is beatable. They shouldn't necessarily be a pushover, mind you, it just needs to be theoretically possible for the protagonist to win. Like we went over when I talked about Yuhobak, without proper restrictions, a power system runs the risk of creating an unbeatable character. Hard universal rules are one of the main ways to avoid these kinds of situations. When done well, they create ways to defeat any given opponent no matter how strong. Araki was smart enough to build several of these rules into stands. 1. Stands are tied to the person they're made from. 2. Hurting a stand also hurts the user. 3. Stands can only be seen by other stand users. 4. The further a stand gets from its user, the weaker it becomes. And then 5. If a stand user dies, the stand, along with all of its abilities, dies with them. As the genre would require, these are all hard, universal rules that apply to every single stand every single time. Or are they? Because actually, every single one of these rules gets broken multiple times from the moment the power system is introduced. 1. Anubis is a 500-year-old stand who turns whoever picks it up into its new user. 2. Aqua Necklace takes a punch from Star Platinum, who can break diamonds without harming a hair on its user's head. 3. Strength takes the form of a full industrial freighter that several normal sailors see and even ride on. 4. Shadow Sabbath works at full strength while its user sits at a prison 5 kilometers away. Then 5. It's specifically pointed out that the souls Osiris steals aren't returned to their owner if the user dies. More than half of those examples are from Part 3, back when these things were still being named after tarot cards and Egyptian gods. I could keep going too. You know how each stand is supposed to only have one ability? Well, tell that to Kira, because Killer Queen has 3 by the end of Diamond is Unbreakable. In Part 4, Araki has to make up a whole new category for stands that work from far away without much user control because there were too many of them. They're called long-range autonomous stands. Even then, Babyhead breaks their usual rules by creating that type out of corpses. At least in the first 6 parts, only 2 rules really seem to stick. 1. Stand users are always drawn to each other, and 2. No stand can bring back the dead. Things could change in the rest of Stone Ocean, I'm still pretty early on in there, and that's not to mention parts 7 through 9, but at least where I am, everything except these 2 is in a constant state of flux. That should be a massive problem. Like, I've spent a good chunk of this video explaining why these kinds of flexible rules would mess with everything, especially a series that relies so heavily on its fights. Usually, if the laws of a power system can break at any time, they might as well not exist in the first place. A Yuhobak can just as easily come from broken rules as it can from a complete lack of rules. We even see Araki get damn close to creating his own Yuhobak several times. Let's just go back to Kira. Like I mentioned, by the end of Part 4, Killer Queen is essentially 3 super broken stands in one. His weakest ability nearly kills Star Platinum. Then there's the Requiem stands, practical gods who can casually control entire cities worth of souls or consign people into a living hell of infinitely repeating deaths. That's not even the worst of this rule breaking though, at least those ones are part of their respective climaxes. Halfway through Part 5, in a fight that doesn't remotely matter to the plot, Team Bucciarati meets a stand called Notorious B.I.G. Notorious B.I.G. is a long-range autonomous stand that absorbs anything it touches and activates upon its user's death. Activating upon its user's death makes it literally impossible to stop. A stand can only truly be defeated somehow through its user, and with this one's already dead, there are exactly 0 ways to conventionally beat it. How in God's name does Araki get away with stuff like this? Even as we go along and the parts have more and more to them, each one is still 80% fight scenes against random people. How can he play things this fast and loose without obliterating any sense of balance? Well, to cut a long story short, he does it by being absolutely exceptional at tailoring a bunch of different things together to work for one specific sequence. This is why so many any stand abilities can seem so random and convenient. They exist entirely to fuel this week's puzzle, no matter how weird it is. Same deal for the hero's simple versatile powers. They're done that way because they need to fit a bunch of different fights, while the villains can be tailor-made for just one or two. It's this approach to his puzzles that allows Araki to break every rule all the time and never destroy the balance of his systems, because he's not treating them as part of a whole power system at all, but as pieces of this one specific puzzle. Let's look at Notorious B.I.G. again, going even more thoroughly. This thing should be a horrific addition to the canon. Again, without a user, there's no real way to defeat it, so as long as you point it in the right direction, your enemies have no chance. Outside of some very specific trump cards, like Part 4's Ghost Alleyway or maybe a Requiem stand, this thing is unstoppable. This stand should shatter the balance. It doesn't, though. And that's because the entire puzzle that the antagonist of is set to work around its quirks. For one thing, Team Bucciarati doesn't fight B.I.G. on the ground or around people. It shows up in a private jet that only they're on. That way, we don't need to deal with it eating the ground or something, and there isn't anyone else to distract it with their movements. Most of the team is even put away in the turtle, so we can focus on the protagonist of this sequence, Trish. Furthermore, the plane is specifically traveling over the ocean, so dropping B.I.G. out the window won't destroy Italy or something. The waves will capture its motion detection and the sea can just gain one more creature. Purely through setting, Hirohiko Araki has transformed this world-ending final boss into just another puzzle. We don't actually need to worry about killing an unkillable stand because that isn't the problem. It's really just, how can Trish use Spicy Lady to drop this shithead in the ocean? Like I said, one of Araki's big talents is just tailoring a bunch of crazy elements together to create a puzzle that works. That's how he manages to break the rules. The rules don't matter if they only matter in this one scene. All that brings me to what I think is the core of what makes JoJo's fight scenes so damn good, at least in the first 6 parts. Where a lot of battle manga can get kind of boring and pointless with this kind of fight to plot ratio, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure pulls it off by not writing fights at all, but instead elaborate mental puzzles and Scooby-Doo masks. By using a power system that can vary its levels of freedom and limitation, Araki is able to craft these individualized, heavily scripted sequences that blend often highly specific enemy abilities with versatile hero powers and specially crafted settings to create a brand new, completely unique puzzle that the protagonist can solve with or without much plot. He then does that over and over and over and over again across 9 parts, 987 chapters, and nearly 40 years without ever running out of ideas. Fucking somehow.